Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be giving you an introduction to theatre in the Soviet Union. First of all, I do want to say that I have put this channel on the back burner for the past few years because life got in the way, but I'm back and let's get started. When we talk about theatre in Russia, we normally always talk about three people: Stanislavski, Chekhov and Meyerhold, but that's not the be-all and end-all of how theatre worked in the USSR. Using his book on theatre in the Soviet Union, Andre Van Gyseghem, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, anyway, he paints a really good picture of what theatre in the Soviet Union was like in the 1930s. So first of all, we have the role of the state. Now, it's no surprise that in the USSR, all theatres were state-controlled and were put under the jurisdiction of the Commissariat of Education. Now, the state's responsibility functioned in two different ways. The first one was with direct control of state theatres. Now, these theatres, such as the Bolshoi or the Moscow Art Theatre, they were seen as producing high artistic value. And they were controlled directly by the Commissariat, or the Narkompros, as it was abbreviated to. The other way theatres were run in the USSR were through local organisations, but given how power and control were centralised in the Soviet Union, in the book, state control is described as differing only in formalities of management. Like all theatres today, theatres in the Soviet Union had artistic directors. Now, they were responsible for the financial control of the theatre and acted as a bridge between the theatre and the local government authority. The artistic director had two assistants. Now, the rules stated that at least one of those assistants had to be a member of the Communist Party. The artistic director themselves didn't have to be, but it was the Soviet Union after all. Now, the logistics of what was performed there ran as so. Every year the theatre had a plan. The artistic director would choose a repertoire of plays depending on their preferred style. So, for example, Stanislavski liked naturalism, as did Chekhov. Then a literary advisor would collect and read plays to be considered by a committee. The committee would vote on the list of plays to create a final list sent to the Narkompros, along with a budget or costings to be approved. Now, what is interesting is if a theatre made a loss on a show or throughout a season, and it kind of gives us a glimpse into what central government thought about culture and the arts. You see, the Narkompros would foot the bill, as easy as that. They saw it as a necessary expenditure of cultural development in the Soviet Union. And when a show made a profit, it was reinvested back into the theatre, whether that was the theatre building itself or the acting school associated with the theatre. It was seen as necessary to improve the actor or the worker's condition. Another way in which we see a glimpse into the central government's attitude to theatre during this period is the way in which tickets were sold. The central ticket office in Moscow would often buy up whole productions of seats months in advance. They would then sell this to the unions at the like-for-like cost, who would then sell it to the workers at a reduced rate, thus encouraging people to go to the theatre. So what about actors? How did they get their training in the Soviet Union? Well, this book details how actors got trained at the Kamerny Theatre in Moscow. Again, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly. Now, this theatre is actually quite interesting because in the 1950s, I believe, the cultural policy in the Soviet Union had changed and this theatre suffered as a result of that and had to close down. Nevertheless, this book offers a really good insight to Soviet actor training during the 1930s or early to mid-Stalinist era. To start, there were no fees for actor training in the Soviet Union. In fact, training actors were paid between 45 to 75 rubles per month, so kind of like a maintenance loan, but they didn't have to pay it back. In their first year, actors would carry on with general education, history, politics, languages, psychology, but they would also look at speech, diction, breathing, and even makeup. In their second year, students would continue their general education, but focusing on class struggle, Leninism, dialectical materialism, and the building of the Soviet state. The acting part would look at movement, acrobatics, and speech. In this year, students could also be in the ensemble of professional productions at the theatre. In their third year, students would continue to look at the history of the revolution. They would then do more intense practical training, more acrobatics, more focus on movement, the synthesis of their movement. And they would also be encouraged to develop and act out characters from short stories up to full-length novels. Students would then be encouraged to work on their own plays during the end-of-year break, and they would tour these plays in clubs and factories. Students could also move away from the ensemble and into small roles at the theatre. And finally, in their final year, students would look at full-length plays and the different varieties of acting styles from the classic to contemporary period. Once they graduated, they became fully fledged members of the theatre and could act in major roles there, if they chose to. They could always move to another theatre and act there as well. Now in its later years, the Community Theatre did struggle against the state. You see, cultural policy shifted over this time. The history of the Community Theatre is actually quite interesting. You see, as we get towards the later Stalinist years, you see the change in cultural shift in the Soviet Union and the effect that this had on theatres. In fact, Stalin even dubbed this theatre as, quote, a real bourgeois theatre. The theatre itself was bombed during the Second World War, during the siege of Moscow, and the final production was staged there in 1946, when it was forced to close because, quote, the Communist Party condemned all formalism and experimentation in literature and the arts. From 1946 up until Stalin's death in 1953, the Zhdanov cultural policy took its hold over the USSR. It sought to attack and condemn bourgeois acts of literary and cultural work. In fact, I've got a quote here that sums it up. It's summarised by the phrase, "The only conflict that is possible in Soviet culture is the conflict between good and best." Socialist realism was the only real art form that was promoted during this time. Anyone who didn't conform was persecuted. Given the Soviet Union's history, there is a lot that I could go into detail about, but I might save that for another video. If you're interested in Soviet theatre, then I would definitely start with this book. There is a lot more in this book than I've been able to cover today, such as national minorities in theatre, children in theatre, and even trade union theatre. But that is it for today. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. See you soon.